Black-bottom girls who make the rockin' world go round.
Little something for the ladies. Now, I'm also available on alternative social media on MeWe, James Desborough, all one word, on Minds, Grimachu. I'm no longer on Gab. I've deleted my account because it's even more exhausting than Twitter. Oi. Hello, lovelies. I want to reply to Parko from GMS magazine. I want to try not to be a dick about it, and I want to bring into that conversation the recent diversity announcement from Dungeons & Dragons and Wizards of the Coast, so official announcement, I guess. I know this all seems rather petty compared to everything else that's going on, but I think the kerfuffles and problems in the RPG community are emblematic of a larger issue, and I think the similar fights that we've had since 2014 really in various areas of gaming are also emblematic of the broader polarization that's gone on in society. You know, games and pastimes and hobbies used to be things that brought people together across these sorts of lines, and now they're not. But take it away, Parko.
Is the gaming hobby beginning to splinter between the right and the left of society? What then for those gamers who are centralists? What about publishers? Do we focus on one side or try to supply all sides? Does the hobby face losing centralists because they are forced to choose one side or the other? In the 70s and 80s, we were all geeks and nerds. Now we are politicized and becoming polarized.
I'm not going to put everything that Parko says in this video. I'm just going to pick out the things that I want to reply to. But the overall thrust of his argument is kind of lost in a misunderstanding of centrism, I think. I'm not centrist. I'm extremely far left. But centrism is not in the middle. It just means you take ideas and concepts from wherever and you put them together. That is more like me, but I would absolutely not describe myself as centrist. And I think there's a lot of people who object to the woke agenda who aren't right-wing at all. And I think that is part of what's been lost in all these debates and discussions. It's very easy to just slap a label on someone, and you'd think people who are concerned about LGBT representation, racial representation and so on would be wary of labels, but nonetheless it happens. So you have to understand that centrism is not being in the middle. It's not halfway between two views. It's not between homophobia and homophilia, right? It's all over the place. It's a mixture of ideas that doesn't necessarily adhere to any particular camp. Like, you might support the idea that Black Lives Matter because you believe that all human lives matter equally, but you may not be on board with some of the more radical feminist views and so on that you find on the Black Lives Matter website, or the ideas that the originators have espoused. You're not in the centre because you believe that all human life is equal, which is a left-wing idea, but you're likely to get demonised as though you were on the right because you're just not 100% on board. So I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding in Parko's reply, in that he mischaracterises and misunderstands what centrism is. And I'm not a centrist, and I can see that.
We cannot be centralists in some issues, which are the ones that are actually polarizing us. You cannot be a centralist in the issue of diversity. You either are diverse or you aren't. You are either homophobic or you aren't. But the thing is, it is becoming very clear that silence is complicit. So if you are, oh no, live and let live, everybody has to get along, you're actually contributing to the problem, because you are not fighting the issue. And unfortunately, the paradox of intolerance does apply to the world of gaming as well, to us.
As I said, this misunderstands what you might think of as centrism. For example, you might think that discrimination against homosexuals is wrong, against trans people is wrong, that everyone should be given respect and allowed to live equally the same as everybody else. But you might, and these aren't my own opinions, but you might draw the line at drag queen story time for kids. Or you might draw the line at doing away with the very idea of biological gender, and there are extremists and activists who do advocate that. You know, you may draw the line at any other point, but still be tolerant and understanding and willing to live and let live, as you say, which should be the goal, really. And for all these people to be treated as fundamentally the same as anybody else, and to be extended every right and privilege that makes sense to do so. But you may draw the line somewhere at, say, biological sex, or being worried about particular outlooks and ideologies being forced, in inverted commas, on kids. Again, these are not necessarily my opinions, but I can understand where people are coming from when they express them, even if I don't agree with them. And so there are middle positions. You can be against homophobia, but still have reservations about certain things, like forced diversity. Why does every show have to have, look at me, I'm gay, at some point in it? Isn't that patronizing? You know, I fit into certain minority categories, and I get very offended when a token character is just put in to tick a box. It's much more effective for me to see my diversity is represented in an organic and unforced way. So you can be all for diversity, but against forced diversity, box ticking exercises, patronizing inclusion, things like that. The paradox of tolerance is an important thing to look at here, because like a lot of people, I think Parko doesn't understand the paradox of tolerance. Most people understand it as the idea that a society should not be tolerant of intolerance, because this creates a paradox where you tolerate people being intolerant, and that creates an intolerant society, which is a lot of tolerance in a single sentence. But here's how it's actually formulated, because most people forget to give the full context. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. That's as far as most people quote. Keep going. In this formulation, I do not imply, for instance, that we should always suppress the utterance of intolerant philosophies. So long as we can counter them by rational argument and keep them in check by public opinion, suppression would most certainly be unwise. But we should claim the right to suppress them if necessary, even by force, for it may easily turn out that they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument, but begin by denouncing all argument. They may forbid their followers to listen to rational argument because it is deceptive, and teach them to answer arguments by the use of their fists or pistols. We should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right not to tolerate the intolerant. Short version: intolerant speech should be tolerated as much as possible. It's only when that leaks over into behaviour, into violence, that we should then resort to suppressing it. It's basically another expression of the harm principle, which is that the only basis upon which it is right and just to suppress someone else's freedoms is when they impinge on others, when they cause harm. So, for example, you're allowed to express your hatred for a minority, but not to call for violence against that minority, for example. So, we don't understand centrism in this video, we don't understand the paradox of tolerance in this video, and we don't understand that there can be tolerant middle grounds between hatred and active promotion. it's an issue. And when you think about who Popper is talking about in the Paradox of Tolerance, when he says people who refuse to argue on a rational basis, denounce all argument, forbid people to listen to argument, which side of the debate does that really sound like these days? And it pains me to say so as a lifelong lefty, but this modern pseudo-left sounds like who Popper is talking about there.
Intolerance, bigots are not going to want to see some things and they will not buy those products. And on the other hand, if I have to choose between buying a book that has diversity and buying a book that doesn't, guess who's going to get my money? It's as simple as that.
Invisible hand tends to more often be an argument from the right, but it's also an invalid argument because people who aren't bigots get painted as bigots, often by rivals, jealous people, people with axes to grind. I've been called a bigot. It does not describe me in any way that I can recognise whatsoever for them to do that. Parco has blocked me on social media for reasons that I can't even remember. Probably fucking nothing, same as usual. People get cancelled, so it's no good saying "my market, my invisible hand" when the market becomes distorted by outrage mobs and people who aren't bigots get labelled as bigots, products get pulled or censored, and there's only a very few outlets that really exist for games publishing. At this point, it's an extremely fragile and vulnerable ecosystem to outrage. And it's probably only a matter of time before that starts going from right to left as well as left to right. Yeah, these kind of tools, cancelling people, censoring people, they're bludgeons. They're unsubtle. And the market is not particularly on the side of games with an agenda. Get woke, go broke is a catchphrase for a reason. It has a kernel of truth to it. But equally, far-right games and so on aren't particularly going to succeed. Politics distorts quality, distorts the game. A diverse representation doesn't guarantee a good game. It's a very poor measure of quality, particularly because it tends to indicate a sort of patronising and preachy worldview that drags the rest of the game down. This is why Rage Against the Machine only had maybe one good album.
We have to publish what we want to publish, what we think is the right thing to publish. Then people will like it or not. And if we publish something that people deem to be inappropriate or incomplete or flawed in any way, shape or form, that's the way it goes. I don't think that we can please everybody all the time. I think that is such an impossibility.
That's true, and that's a healthy attitude, but that's not how it works, is it? Later on, though I've cut it, Parker goes into a rant about people becoming outraged about outrage. But it's not necessarily the outrage that people are outraged about, it's the effect of that outrage. It's the censorship, it's the chilling effect, it's the disingenuous accusations, it's the misrepresentations, it's the labelling as a bigot of some kind or another that goes on, and the loss of the ability to publish, the freedom to publish, the free expression that people have. Yeah, even bigots have a right to free expression. But yeah, what more needs to be said there? But people who aren't bigots are being censored and pilloried and cancelled over fuck all. Right? So it is not a free market. The outrage at the outrage is because the initial outrage leads to badly thought out, often knee-jerk reactions, as we'll get to in a bit.
And in the 70s and 80s, we were all geek and nerds getting along. Yes, because, people like me, we had to swallow the fact that we saw an awful lot of really homophobic, ableist shit because we didn't want to make an issue out of it. And we're bored. We're tired of that.
Repeat after me, everyone. The plural of anecdote is not data. That's a misquote. but it is nonetheless true. Anecdotes aren't data. That's your personal experience, and even if multiple other people have had bad experiences, that still doesn't say anything about what's true or not about the hobby. There are plenty of us, I would dare say more of us, who've had near universally positive experiences in the gaming field since its inception, with inclusion and diversity in ways that it actually matters. So it's our anecdotes against your anecdotes at the moment, and there's been no real study into it, and there's unlikely to be any study into it. So that leaves us with you having to prove some sort of endemic bigotry in the hobby and carrying the burden of proof to do so. My experience, not that it matters because it's anecdote again, not only has gaming always been diverse and welcoming, but it's often been a vehicle by which we've been able to teach other people tolerance without beating them over the head with it. We certainly softened one guy's attitudes when it comes to homophobia by constant exposure to our attitudes through the game, but we weren't preaching to him. It was just a kind of natural outreach and us expressing some disapproval whenever he expressed any fears or issues or phobias, which, as it turned out, he had good reason for, but he developed and matured beyond it through the role-playing experience. So, no, that's bullshit. What we used to have that unified us was a common enemy. There were people out to censor and control and even burn D&D books. You know, there's Pat Pulling trying to link it to suicide in the same sort of way that computer games have been tried to be linked with violence over and over again, unsuccessfully. Right? There was an external enemy. There was a common outcast status. But that opening, welcoming attitude seems to have been abused by people who've now come into the hobby and have been sort of, whoa, nice base you got here, General. Be a shame if something happened to it, sort of. Yeah, and abusing their welcome, abusing people's eagerness to be supportive and inclusive and nice and fluffy and lovely by vandalising what's already there and often tearing the guts out of what made gaming good, or even what made gaming art, or even what made gaming important, in an attempt to kind of homogenise it, weirdly, in the name of diversity, but without any viewpoint diversity. Yeah, it's a hard thing to wrap your head around.
So are we becoming more polarized? Only because more people want to continue saying sexist, homophobic, and generally bigoted views in our hobby, and we don't.
Balderdash, nonsense and piffle. No. Your sensitivity is too high. You call things homophobic or bigoted or racist or whatever that aren't. And it's gotten so absurd, and this is even outside of the gaming sphere within other forms of fiction, it's gotten so absurd that people assume motives on the part of the author when they write something evil into a game. But that's where conflict is. And, you know, villains and baddies do evil things. But you've now got the absurdly nonsensical position of authors being held accountable for the actions of their villains in books, or not including diversity even where it's not appropriate. Now, in fantasy, there's what I call the dragons argument, which is that, okay, if you've got magic and dragons and all this other stuff in your fantasy world, well, why can't you have a more tolerant society? Where everything that we hold dear now is considered fine and dandy. Well, there is a paradox there, and it's similar to the uncanny valley. You know, something that's almost photorealistic human but isn't quite freaks us out. It has that uncanniness effect, that unhinging surreality, almost fear-inducing effect. And in a similar way, we're extremely fine-tuned to understand how human societies and interactions work. plus we have our knowledge or our assumptions about history. So if you've got a fantasy medieval world that's weirdly diverse and weirdly accepting in a way that we know the world at that time wasn't, and that doesn't seem realistic from what we intuit about human nature, that's going to be a glaring problem. And it doesn't matter how many dragons or fairies or spells or whatever else you put in there, it has to make sense. My other go-to example of this is China Mayville's Perdita Street Station. It's full of weirdness and absurdity and nonsense, but the human or non-human interactions within it, within this insane world of gibberish, those make sense, and that's what makes the whole story make sense, and it's what carries our suspension of disbelief through the book. So it's not enough to just argue, oh, there are dragons. And this is where the D&D diversity statement comes in, because you're arguing that people should be able to publish whatever they want, do whatever they want. But even Wizards of the Coast has been forced to bend the knee to these sorts of demands to the point where it has now become absurd. What are they talking about? Okay, unfortunate use of terminology, but stemming from the fantasy novels involved, fantasy games have tended to have races. And much like you've got different embodiments of different aspects of human nature in Star Trek, between Klingons and Vulcans and whoever else, in fantasy games you have the fantasy races. So elves are actually, it's more like species. So elves have particular tendencies and physical characteristics and aptitudes. Dwarves have their own, halflings have their own, half-orcs have their own, and all the rest of it. And on top of all that, you've had humans who have always been represented as being freer, able to choose what they want, to have more of a choice in how they focus. And humans have also not ever really been tied to any particular alignment, particularly in D&D. So they are a representation of human diversity and free will and so on. And in most of these fantasy games, there are all manner of human societies of all colours, hues, ideologies, religions, analogues to the real world or entirely new, loads of them. And yet, despite all the great panoply and diversity of humanity being represented within humans, within fantasy games, somehow we have decided over recent years that orcs are racist. Orcs don't reel. Dwarves don't reel. Elves don't reel. Kobolds don't reel. These are not real people. They're not analogues to human beings. We have humans for that. And when it comes to these races and so on being inherently evil, it used to be a challenging question and debate topic. Is it moral, just and good for my paladin to slaughter baby goblins? Well, within the D&D paradigm, you have alignment. Good and evil, law and chaos, these are not subjective moral systems. These are absolutes that have an intrinsic existence and a planar reflection. And gods are real, and gods have created evil races to do evil deeds in an evil way, in an evil land. So within the context of the cosmology and the metaphysic of D&D, inherent evil is a thing. Now that's a beautiful and a wonderful thing in fiction, because it is outside of our normal experience and allows us to contemplate things under a different set of rules. And that's what gaming should be about in a large part, is experiencing things that aren't real, things that aren't true, what ifs, existing in another world, existing in another viewpoint, and examining the world from within that viewpoint. So, for example, a gay man playing a homophobically intolerant, lawful good paladin in an authentic medieval setting might gain valuable insight into where evangelicals like the Westboro Baptists are coming from. Play something outside your comfort zone, experience other points of view, other worlds, other metaphysics, other moral schema. If you want to be pretentious about it, there's that side, but it's also fun to do these things, and it can also give you valuable insights into yourself and to others. And if we make every single game and every single game world into this hodgepodge, grey mush, United Colours of Benetton, Hands Across the World, Rainbow Nation thing, it's all the same. There's no diversity. You're not exploring those other points of view, those other ideas, such as inherent evil, which you find in orcs. And in food, fat is where the flavour is. In games, in stories, in media of most kinds, conflict, problems, obstacles, that's where the flavour is when it comes to story. So if you live in a world stripped of all bigotry, of the very idea of objective evil, of motivations for bad guys to do bad things, where nothing stands against you, where nobody is bigoted, where's the conflict then? What are you just playing house? What happens? Do you expect dungeons to be wheelchair accessible? How far does this go? But creating a game that has conflict, that has bigotry, that has hatred, and so on within it, says little to nothing about the author, other than they want to tell an interesting story, and where their interest in that moment lies. That's it, nothing more. But the fact that D&D has bent to this, and they're now saying, okay, all of these races are no longer inherently evil, well, that fundamentally shatters the underlying metaphysic behind vanilla D&D. It's just swept away, it's gone. No inherently evil orcs, no inherently evil goblins. This was a challenging, interesting idea in the 90s. Now it's hackneyed, which is why I'm enjoying things like Goblin Slayer so much, because they go back. And it's now more challenging to consider something as inherently and innately evil than it is to consider it morally grey. And also they talk about in this article getting rid of various stat bonuses or making them not matter. What's a dwarf if they're not short? What's a dwarf if they're not bearded? What's a dwarf if they don't have stone cunning or whatever else it might be? Fat elves? It's just none of it's going to mean anything anymore. These aren't going to be meaningful choices. So what's the point? If everyone's an exception, nobody is. Playing a half-orc, struggling with the fact that he's a product of rape, and that his father is inherently and innately evil, and struggling to fight against that side of his nature, that's an interesting story. A fluffy, happy-go-lucky, bisexual, non-ugly orc without even a hint of rage or evil about him, living a fluffy, happy life as a baker in some kind of bucolic village near Bag End. That's not much of a story, right? So it's all very well saying publish and be damned, but the outrage machine is toxic, is acidic to people's creativity and to good stories. Right? You can't please everyone, but the demand is that we please everyone. And so Wizards are now talking about hiring sensitivity readers, which is a bit like inviting Bomber Harris to be your city planner. Why would you hire someone to sabotage your book? Auteurs are better generally when they get it right, because they're auteurs, because there aren't that many cooks stirring the broth, because they're not having so much of an editing eye sabotaging everything that they say. Look, the cost of your utopia is good stories, is challenging stories, is viewpoint diversity. Live and let live is where we should be aiming for. Someone's allowed to be a bigot, someone's allowed to express that bigotry. That's all fine under the paradox of tolerance. It's when they actually start affecting or harming people that it actually matters. I know you shouldn't bring facts to an emotion fight, but you have to. Zang.
Postmortem Studios.
role-playing games, and a lot more to die for. Post-mort.com